Venezuela is back in the news again and under attack. After repeatedly increasing tensions in the Caribbean Ocean, the United States unilaterally struck Caracas and kidnapped President Nicolas Maduro. Now, a lot has been said about the obvious risk this poses to global peace, the threat of nuclear war, and the illegality of this cowardly maneuver, both under US and international law. But very few people are asking about the economic consequences of such an action. So, question stands. What would happen if Venezuelan oil were to suddenly disappear from the global market?
I'm Noah Shank, and the stagflation crisis of the 1970s may teach you more than you'd reckon about the very real economic consequences of a conflict with Venezuela. Before we can get into the nitty gritty of what happened and why it matters, we have to define stagflation. Now, stagflation is a combination of two economic concepts, that being stagnation, a lack of economic growth, and inflation, the devaluing of a currency. Which leads us to yet another very important question. What is it that causes inflation? Now, typical answers about what causes inflation tend to talk about Weimar Germany. They talk about there just being too much money in circulation because the government has printed too much. In Weimar Germany, the German government had printed money in order to pay debts that they owed to the Allied powers as a result of World War I. And so you had a situation where money was so worthless that people were literally using wheelbarrows full of marks in order to buy loaves of bread. But if we were to use this explanation, which is far too simple, we would be ignoring almost 100 years of economic development in theory. In order to really understand what causes inflation, we have to dive into a very, very important Marxist concept, that being a crisis of overproduction, or a value crisis. To derive the value of a commodity, we can use a very, very simple equation, that being A plus B plus C equals D. In this situation, A represents the cost of materials put into the creation of that product. B represents the cost of transportation or distribution of that said product. C represents the total labor power put into that product. And D represents the total value of that commodity on the market. Now, you may have heard the phrase, human labor power is the origin of all value, and this comes from something very important. That is that the capitalist cannot change the price of A or B. Those are set by the market. They're objective factors. They're what we call fixed rates. And they're set by the market. The capitalist is forced to pay the cost of the materials, which is set by the market, and they're forced to pay the cost of fuel, etc., for the cost of transportation. But C is what we call a variable. Now, that is, it can change. And what the capitalist tends to do is they divide C into two parts, that being C1 and C2. C1 represents the wages paid out to the workers, and C2 represents the profit that the capitalist can take away at the end of the day, what we call their surplus value. Now, a lot of people will point to this equation, a lot of so-called Marxists will point to it and they'll say, well, see, it's not fair. The worker, he produced the commodity, and yet the capitalist is taking surplus value. It's unfair. And then the response is, well, don't you think the capitalists put up the capital? They're taking the risk. Don't you think that they deserve to be compensated? And both arguments are missing the point. Because C is always smaller than D, and C1 by extension is also smaller than D. And so the amount of wages being paid out to potential consumers on a macro scale is always going to be less than the amount of supposed value that is on the market. That is to say, nobody is being paid enough to buy back the products that are being produced. So you will always have a situation where there are more commodities on the market than there is capital to be able to buy it back. And this creates a huge problem because you have this immense supply of commodities on the market and no demand for it because people can't afford them. And so increasingly, the market gets flooded with useless commodities. And this problem begins to be exacerbated when we add in technology. You see, as a company expands and reinvests in itself, each individual worker is becoming more efficient. It's the only way in which the capitalist can continue to drive a profit and continue to reinvest and expand that company. So more commodities are being produced with a smaller proportion of wages being paid out. Those commodities are worth less. And this is made even worse by the incentive to invest in labor-saving technologies. Because the capitalist is getting less of a profit on any individual given commodity that they're producing, they're incentivized to produce more. And that way they can compete with potential competitors who may drive them out of business. And they can continue to drive a profit to expand the company. And that creates another problem because they've invested in a labor-saving technology that will again reduce the role of wages paid out to the laborers. The commodities are worth less and less, and the capitalist is incentivized to produce more in order to make up the difference. But because he's trying to make up the difference by producing more commodities, those commodities are worth less, and so people can afford them even less, and this produces an economic crisis. Now, every economist seriously acknowledges this problem, but they have different names for it. A classical economist might call it the problem of glut. A Marxist economist might call it a problem of overproduction or a value crisis, whereas a Keynesian economist, they might call it a crisis of underconsumption. And they have very different solutions for what might happen. Now, a Marxist would argue that the solution is simply to rationally plan the economy, to make sure that banks, factories, and industries are working in the interests of the common good according to a rational plan, thus allowing economic growth to happen. But the British economist John Maynard Keynes had a very different solution. He argued that because there is all of this value on the market that is not being paid out to potential consumers, the government should just begin to pay people. They should make up jobs and subsidize industries and create fake jobs and social programs in order to make up the difference, to flood the economy with extra money to make up the value that would have otherwise been produced on the market. The example he gives is digging a ditch. He says that we should pay somebody to dig a ditch and then fill it back in. It actually doesn't matter whether or not that public work is productive. All that matters is that somebody is getting paid value to do it in the form of their wages. And the U.S. government engages in all kinds of this. For example, there is a cave in Springfield, Missouri. The U.S. government has bought up millions of pounds of cheese, buried and refrigerated it in order to subsidize dairy farmers. When Richard Nixon kicked Milton Friedman out of the White House, he famously said, "We're all Keynesians now." He was referring to what they called the quote-unquote Keynesian consensus in the United States and all across Western countries. The idea was that in order to compete with the Soviet Union and their planned economies, we would all adopt Keynesian policies to prevent another crisis like the Great Depression from happening. The issue with Keynesianism is that the value crisis still exists. You're just printing money to offset it. And so the rate of profit is continuing to slow. And this means that companies are not incentivized to reinvest in themselves and to expand, nor are they incentivized to invest in a labor-saving technology like artificial intelligence, etc., because they're being artificially propped up. Nor are they incentivized to invest in a labor-saving technology that, in ordinary circumstances, would vastly increase our society's ability to create wealth because they're being propped up by the government. And this leads to an economic slowdown, what we call stagnation. Now, in 1973, the OPEC countries, an alliance of oil-producing nations, engaged in a boycott against countries that were aiding Israel's illegal occupation of the Palestinians' land, as well as the Yom Kippur War, where Israel went to war with essentially every Arab nation. And this poked another huge hole in the Keynesian consensus. Because Keynesian assumes the market is always going to be flooded with these worthless commodities, and that consumers have to be subsidized to purchase those commodities in order to make sure that they still have market value. And this works, and it does not cause inflation, all the money that is being printed. Why is that? Because the amount of money, which is a proxy of value, relative to the amount of commodities that are in existence, stays the same. So inflation is not really a huge problem. There's a huge amount of commodities on the market, and yeah, there's more money on the market, but the market's also being flooded with all these commodities, and people are being paid out wages to buy them. And so the economy can remain stable, slow, but stable. But when a shock to the market happens, something like the OPEC boycott, especially which creates a situation where commodities are suddenly pulled from existence, especially a crucial commodity like oil, it produces huge problems. And you see a crisis of stagflation. You see, the government has been subsidizing all of these companies by printing money. And suddenly, that money is not usable to buy a large number of commodities that would have existed otherwise, but have been pulled from the market. And so, not only is the economy continuing to stagnate, but you see record inflation. And this is exactly what happened in the 1970s in America. And with the scarcity of a hugely important commodity like oil that facilitates all exchange, you saw the rationing of oil, mass unemployment, increased homelessness, and goods being, like bread, being unaffordable to nearly everybody. The economy nearly collapsed. During this time period, inflation doubled, reaching 6.8% on average for the decade. And unemployment reached the highest number, 8%, it had seen since the Great Depression. A more recent and very similar case occurred in 2022 when the USA successfully provoked Russia into invading Ukraine and used that as a justification to pull Russian oil off the market, which had been acting as a competitor to American oil companies. Now, this increased the oil prices drastically, while demand for oil, which facilitates all exchange, remained constant. It made companies like BP, Shell, Chevron, and ExxonMobil a fuck ton of money and a lot more profit. But the results for the American people was disastrous. Firstly, gas prices went through the roof. I remember gas being like $5 a gallon at one point. But more importantly, America once again saw another crisis of stagflation. You see, since 2008, the Federal Reserve and the US government has been printing trillions and trillions of dollars in what they call quantitative easing in a sort of Keynesian technocratic way to stabilize the economy and keep it afloat. They don't want to see another 2008 happen, another Great Recession. And this was exacerbated again during the COVID-19 pandemic with all of those aid packages that were paid out, primarily to corporations, but also to American citizens, engaged in trillions more of dollars printed in order to prevent the economy from completely collapsing during an election year. Suddenly, billions and billions of dollars of an extremely crucial commodity, oil, was ripped off the market, while the Fed continued to print money at similar rates. The results, eggs are now $7 a dozen, buddy. Now imagine what would have happened if Venezuela, a country that has oil reserves 4 times the size of Russia, were to also be pulled off the market. Firstly, I'm sure that the American oil bankers would make trillions of dollars. They'd be making a lot of profit. But more importantly, at least to me, the American people would suffer tremendously. In fact, we may see a full-on societal collapse. So we've established that invading Venezuela would be disastrous for the American people. We've also established that inflation is a huge problem right now. So how do we fix it? Well, the answer of capitalist economists, at least traditionally, has been through degrowth methods. Using degrowth to pull money out of circulation. Now, Democrats typically do this through very technocratic ways. For example, the Biden administration and the Carter administration both drastically increased interest rates through the Federal Reserve. Now, how is this supposed to help inflation? Well, the idea is that if Americans can no longer afford to take out loans to buy homes or start businesses, then that money is theoretically no longer in circulation, and the commodities on the market remain the same. So, therefore, the high interest rates mean that people won't be circulating as much money, and theoretically at least, inflation will begin to go down. Another thing they do is environmental regulations and reforms, cracking down on them heavily in a way, cracking down on Another very common thing is the enforcing of environmental regulations and restrictions in another attempt to try and reduce the amount of circulating capital, preventing people from engaging in trade through red tape. Now, the Republican Party, under Trump and Reagan, but both parties in general, also engage in another form of degrowth, and this is a much more common one, that being austerity, government cuts and spending. So the idea is that you fire a bunch of government employees and cut a bunch of social benefits that Americans were receiving. Then the money that would have been printed to fund such programs and to fund the wages of those well-paid government employees and their benefits, etc., doesn't exist anymore. And so, in theory, inflation should go down. Now, the Trump administration in particular has innovated the use of tariffs as a form of degrowth. By pulling more American money out of circulation in the form of increased taxes on foreign goods, the idea is that less money is in circulation, and it has the added benefit of disincentivizing Americans from buying goods on the market because they're too expensive, which further decreases the amount of money theoretically in circulation. The common thread here is that capitalist solution to inflation does so at the expense of what actually makes inflation a problem in the first place. It fails to recognize that inflation is a problem because it makes the lives of ordinary people difficult. In fact, they abstract it into this random number that they pull from the ether as a marker, an artificial marker that means nothing. And so they drive down the living standards of ordinary people in order to prevent inflation, when the whole point of why inflation is a problem is that it hurts the living standards of ordinary people because they can't afford to buy goods. And this is the secret. This is the secret behind the remarkable recovery that the German economy was able to make under the Nazis. You see, the Nazis were able to fix the inflation of Weimar Germany by creating a slave labor underclass. They called this reverse inflation. The idea was that you pull millions of Germans out of the workforce on the basis of their ethnicity, and you create a massive war machine oriented towards destroying commodities all around the world. The Nazis were able to temporarily fix the German economy, but it was ethereal. By 1939, the German economy was going to completely collapse, and that's why they had to start World War II. The real solution to the crisis we're in is having a rationally planned economy. We need to live in a society where people don't get poorer because there's too much housing, where banks, factories, and industries are in the public hands and lend credit to serve the public good, allowing the economy to grow in a stable manner and ordinary people to flourish. You need to incentivize people to start their own businesses without being crushed by monopolies. We need a government of action that fights for working families and a movement that demands both an end to these forever wars and economic justice at home. If America is to have any future, we need to integrate with the emerging BRICS alternative that is rising with the East, instead of clinging to the Western dying system. We need a government of action that fights for working families. We need a movement of ordinary people. Thanks for watching.